Iran thought that its troubles on Kharg Island were over. The US had hit the island hard, ruining its military infrastructure, but at least the oil terminals and pipelines were spared. Cash could keep rolling in to prop up the ailing Iranian regime, but not for much longer. The US is sending something massive to Kharg Island. The US may be preparing for the largest ground operation against Iran in decades, and it could leave Iran's regime in tatters. We'll explain why later in the video. First, what on earth is happening at Kharg Island? Right now, the island is still trying to recover from a wave of US attacks that totally obliterated every military target on the island, per US President Donald Trump. Not a lot has changed on the island since, as its oil operations are still running. But it's not what's happening now that is worrying Iran's regime. It's what's going to happen in the future, as the US is sending something Iran's way that is the last thing the regime wanted to see: US Marines. Or more accurately, even more of them. According to the War Zone, or TWZ, the US is sending the USS Boxer and the rest of its amphibious ready group, or ARG, to the Middle East from their base on the west coast. Coming along for the ride is the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, or MEU, which reportedly has around 2,500 Marines that could be ready to put boots on the ground in Iran, if they get the order. Along with the USS Boxer are a pair of other amphibious warships, the San Antonio-class USS Portland and the Whidbey Island-class USS Comstock, along with air and ground components that could support the 11th MEU if it needs to launch a ground operation. This alone would be massive news, but what makes this report really important is that the 11th MEU isn't the first that the US has ordered to the Persian Gulf region. In mid-March, news broke that the 31st MEU was being deployed to the Middle East from its base in Okinawa, Japan, bringing yet more amphibious assault ships and a contingent of roughly 2,000 Marines with it. Those Marines seem likely to arrive in Iran's waters at some point toward the end of March, and it's looking like the 11th MEU is expected to follow, potentially reinforcing the 31st MEU in the coming weeks to create a contingent of over 4,000 US Marines, along with the air power and amphibious vessels needed to land them on Kharg Island. At least that's one of the options. As you'll discover if you keep watching, there are 3 scenarios that these MEU deployments could support, each with different potential consequences. TWZ notes that what we're seeing right now is an accelerated deployment of manpower that is being sent to Iran in support of Operation Epic Fury. Kharg Island seems to be the likely target for these Marines, and there are other hints that the US is building up to do something on an island that is absolutely critical to Iran's economy. Along with the incoming MEUs, the US has also been deploying the US Navy MQ-4C Triton unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV. This isn't an attack drone. Rather, this UAV is designed to conduct reconnaissance, and that's precisely what it's been doing in the Persian Gulf and Kharg Island regions. On March 20th, one of America's Tritons was even observed orbiting the largest oil terminal on Kharg Island, suggesting that it's keeping a close eye on whatever Iran is trying to do on the small stretch of land. And there's more. The US has also announced that it's deploying Apache helicopters and A-10 Warthogs to the Strait of Hormuz. Both of these aircraft can serve a purpose in the strait, especially in terms of attacking fast boats, Shahid drones, and coastal missile launch sites and ports. However, we can't ignore the fact that both of these aircraft were also used by the US in its wars against Iraq and Afghanistan. What did they do in these wars? The Apache and A-10 set the stage for ground operations in these nations by providing support to ground troops, shaping the battlefield, and taking out fortified positions ahead of arrival. So these aircraft were among the first that the US deployed in these 2 conflicts. And do you want to guess what the first types of ground troops were that the US sent into Afghanistan? US Marines from MEUs. We're starting to get some serious echoes of the past in this deployment of a second MEU to Iran's waters, and all signs are pointing to an operation that is set to take place on Kharg Island. For now, there's no confirmation that Washington has made a final decision, but the pieces being put in place are hard to ignore. Whether that means boots on the ground or not isn't certain, but before we get into what the US is planning to do, let's examine why Kharg Island matters. After all, it's just an island, and one that the US has already destroyed, at least in terms of its military infrastructure. However, it's not this particular type of infrastructure that makes Kharg Island so important. It's another: oil infrastructure, a lot of it. Though it only measures about 5 miles end to end, Kharg Island is where almost all of Iran's oil exports are processed and passed through on their way out of the country and to Iran's clients. Oil, in particular, is Iran's economic lifeblood. The country is home to about 10% of the world's proven oil reserves. It's on Kharg Island that the terminals and pipelines are located that pump Iranian crude and refined oil products onto tankers, which then ship the oil to other countries. According to CBS News, Kharg Island historically handles anywhere between 85 and 95% of all Iran's crude oil exports, and that is a major problem for Iran. Crude oil prices recently surged during the crisis, before pulling back slightly due to Operation Epic Fury. Due to the situation that Iran has created in the Strait of Hormuz, Kharg Island is key to the Iran regime and its ability to keep the cash flowing into the country. The most recent figures we have for Iran's crude oil revenue come from 2024, which is the year that the Tehran Times claimed that oil revenue topped $46 billion for the country. If up to 95% of those sales are made by way of Kharg Island, losing this small strip of land would blow a $43.7 billion hole in Iran's economy at a time when it literally can't afford to let that money go. Therein lies a clear motivation for the US to seize Kharg Island, thus putting a ton of pressure on Iran's regime to capitulate to Operation Epic Fury. But it goes even deeper than that. As another MEU sails toward Iran, the US may also be looking to Kharg Island as a bargaining chip that it can use to pressure Iran into releasing its stranglehold over the Strait of Hormuz. The one thing that Iran can rely upon to perhaps place enough pressure on the US to end Operation Epic Fury is its ability to halt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Billions of dollars of cargo pass through the strait annually, including about 20% of the world's oil, along with 20% of all liquefied natural gas. By preventing ships from passing through the strait, which Iran has mostly done by attacking merchant ships with drones and fast boats, Iran is able to create global price shocks that shake up the world's economies. Do you remember how we mentioned that oil is over $100 a barrel right now? That isn't normal. It's happening because shipments through the strait have been severely disrupted, as tanker captains rightfully don't want to take the risk of their ships being the next Iran targets. So the maths here is simple. US Marines plus a Kharg Island takeover equals a major card that the US can play to force Iran to ease up the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran is going to bring the world's oil and gas supplies to a standstill, the US can respond by snatching away billions of dollars from the Iranian economy. On top of all of that, there's the message that more action on Kharg Island would send, especially if that action involves putting boots on the ground. According to former US Central Command or CENTCOM commander Joseph Votel, that message would be twofold and directed at both Iran and the many nations that rely on the Strait of Hormuz. I get that it has an informational and kind of messaging advantage against the Iranians that we are on their territory, and it may send a message to the broader energy community that we are safeguarding these vital Iranian infrastructures, Votel told TWZ in a March 20th interview. Boots on the ground would indeed tell Iran that the US is serious, as well as communicate to other nations that America is doing what it can to solve the Strait of Hormuz problem. The 11th MEU heading to the Middle East to join the 31st MEU reinforces that message. However, taking that approach with Kharg Island does present some challenges, as we'll get to in a moment. But before we do, there's a lot more where this came from. If you're getting value from the military show, remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. Now, earlier we told you that there are three approaches that the US could take now that it's sending another MEU towards Kharg Island. Boots on the ground is the most obvious, and we'll be getting to that approach in a few minutes. But less obvious and perhaps much less risky is the idea that the US could be planning to use its MEUs to form a small naval blockade around Kharg Island that will stop Iran from exporting its oil. This would be a case of the US giving Iran a small taste of its own medicine by stopping merchant ships from doing what they came to do, albeit without the added terroristic element of attacking those ships. But as TWZ notes, it's certainly an option. Remember that it's not just MEUs that the US is sending to the Middle East right now, it's also sending a pair of ARGs, which amount to about half a dozen amphibious warships that the US could use to prevent merchant ships from getting access to the Kharg Island terminal. The US also has several carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf region. However, deploying warships from those groups may not be an option, as doing so would leave their associated carriers more vulnerable to Iranian counterattacks. The idea behind a blockade would be to neutralize Kharg Island as a factor for Iran in Operation Epic Fury without taking the risk, militarily or politically, of placing boots on the ground. The US could claim to be avoiding an escalation of Operation Epic Fury while still hitting Iran where it hurts, and there is a certain sense of justice in the idea of trading one blockade for another. However, the obvious challenge with this solution would be that the US would have to make its incoming ARGs close to sitting ducks for Iranian drones and missiles. After all, a blockade that doesn't involve zipping in, attacking merchant ships, and getting out, as Iran is doing in the Strait, requires warships to actually block any vessels attempting to make it to Kharg Island. Iran's coastal missile launch sites would get opportunities to strike. But then perhaps that's why A-10s and Apache choppers are being deployed in the Persian Gulf region. The former, at the very least, is a well-suited choice for taking out these coastal launch sites before they become problems for the US. Still, this challenge of dealing with the Iranian response to what the US does next on Kharg Island exists for the second and seemingly most obvious option that the US has for the strip of land, putting boots on the ground. The numbers certainly line up for a ground assault on Kharg Island, and there are some in the US who support this option. Senator Lindsey Graham is one of those people, as The Hill has reported on Graham invoking the spirit of Iwo Jima as he called for the US to take Kharg Island by force. Here's what I tell President Trump: keep it up for a few more weeks, take Kharg Island where all of the resources they have to produce oil, control that island, let this regime die on a vine, Graham declared when speaking to Fox News on Sunday. We still don't know how close the US is to making this particular decision, though it appears that plans are being put in place. Beyond MEUs heading to the Middle East, along with everything else that we've mentioned that could support a ground operation, CBS News reported on March 20th that Pentagon officials have already drawn up detailed plans for deploying US ground forces into Iran. Even Trump himself is using misdirection to prevent people from figuring out what he has planned. "No, I'm not putting troops anywhere," he said to reporters in the Oval Office on March 19th, before quickly adding, "If I were, I certainly wouldn't tell you." So a ground operation might be coming, or it might not. If it does, the number of US Marines that the US is sending in the direction of Kharg Island should be more than enough to take the small strip of land. Votel suggests that the US would probably need between 800 and 1,000 of its Marines to push whatever's left of Iran's forces off Kharg Island. The Sunday Times disputes that figure, suggesting that even the 2,200 Marines or so that are with the 31st MEU may not be enough to take Kharg Island, with the number needed likely to depend on how many Iranian soldiers were killed during America's initial strike against the territory. A large deployment may be needed to hold the island and secure a perimeter around it. Perhaps that's why a second MEU is on its way to the Middle East right now. It's better to have too many Marines and not need them than to have too few and wind up losing those that you need. But what the US has in its incoming MEUs are operators who are trained for precisely this kind of operation, and they're being supported by appropriate intelligence, along with air power that has already set the stage for a ground operation and continues to work in the Strait of Hormuz to make such an operation as safe as possible. Add the artillery, armored vehicles, choppers, and the F-35B vertical takeoff fighter jets that are arriving alongside the MEUs heading toward Iran, and you get a force that should offer more than enough to tackle Iran's fractured troops on Kharg Island. Taking Kharg Island likely won't be much of a problem, especially if the US launches more airstrikes before the arrival of its MEUs. Keeping it, however, brings up the same issues that could affect America's ships if it attempts a naval blockade. Those US Marines and equipment stationed on Kharg Island will become stationary targets for Iran, and despite the country's missile capabilities having been significantly diminished, Iran has shown that it can still hit stationary targets with its ballistic missile. Kharg Island is only about 20 miles away from the Iranian coast. It would certainly be in range of coastal missile launchers, and the US would have to deal with the fact that its nearest base is over 120 miles away. Any resupply vessels the US sends to the island may also have to deal with Iranian drones and fast boats. The US has the air power to deal with those latter threats. The A-10s and Apaches in the Strait of Hormuz ensure that, as they can both serve as escorts to American supply ships. As for missile launchers, the US can hit missile sites that it knows exist, but it can't do much about those that are still hidden until Iran exposes them. The flip side to all of this is that by hitting US Marines on Kharg Island, Iran also risks damaging its own oil pipelines. Would it want to take that risk? Would the risk seem worth it, even if the pipelines are damaged, if US occupation strips away Iran's oil money anyway? These are the questions that will only be answered if the US goes through with putting boots on the ground, as it seems like it might be planning to do, as two MEUs steam toward Iran. But there is a third option, one that the MEUs could support or might not even need to get involved in. The US could just bomb Iran's Kharg oil infrastructure into oblivion and avoid all of the problems that could come with a blockade or occupation. There would certainly be no problems with sitting ducks becoming targets for Iran's missiles. And according to CNBC, by destroying Kharg Island's oil terminal and pipelines, Iran loses out on the 1.5 million barrels per day in crude exports that keep the money flowing into the country. It would take years for Iran to rebuild that infrastructure, and that's assuming it even could after losing so many billions to an American strike. So problem solved. No MEUs required. Well, not really. The Kharg Island infrastructure requiring years to rebuild would mean that the nations that rely on Iranian oil end up with major problems. China is a prominent buyer, as it purchases about 80% of Iran's shipped oil. Tensions are already high between the US and China, and the US doesn't need to make things worse by taking out Kharg Island. All of this is without even mentioning the likelihood that Iran would ramp up its attacks on the energy infrastructure of its Gulf neighbors if the US chose destruction. And we also can't discount the possibility that the US might want to hold Kharg Island so it can push Iran into some sort of agreement where America benefits from the country's oil exports. That could be a tempting carrot to hold out in front of Iran's regime, but it gets swallowed up if the bombs start flying and the Kharg oil infrastructure goes up in smoke. So it's likely that the US is only seriously considering two options: blockade or ground operation. Both will be aided massively by the arrival of the two MEUs en route toward Iran as we speak. In fact, they may not be possible without those MEUs, at least with what the US has deployed in Iran right now. The only question now is whether the 11th and 31st MEUs are actually going to be used. Again, Trump is sending mixed messages. On March 20th, he declared that there will be no ceasefire with Iran, stating that you don't do a ceasefire when you're literally obliterating the other side. But a day later, Trump was implying that he's looking to wind down Operation Epic Fury. Putting boots on the ground in Kharg Island would be the opposite of winding down. And on March 23rd, reports said that Trump claims the US and Iran have held talks on the complete and total resolution of hostilities in the Middle East, which has led to Trump saying he'll hold back on a threat to strike Iran's power stations for 5 days based on these talks. Iran says that these talks never happened. Iran's parliament speaker says that the news of these talks is fake and it's being used to manipulate oil prices. Frankly, it's impossible to guess what the Trump administration's next move is going to be. The one thing we can say for sure is that around 2,500 more US Marines are heading towards Iran, and they likely have Kharg Island in their sights. If the US pulls the trigger, be that on blockading, destruction, or occupation, Iran is staring down the barrel of a multi-billion-dollar black hole in its budget that could end the regime once and for all. The US may be prepping to take out the last thing that is keeping Iran alive, but Kharg Island has already been hit once, as we've discussed in this video, and that strike is taking on a whole new complexion as a second MEU heads towards Iran. Check out our video to learn more about what the US did to Kharg Island earlier in March. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to The Military Show to keep up with our coverage of Operation Epic Fury. And thank you as always for watching.